Thank you, everyone. I hope that you had a really great time visiting during our break. As we shared yesterday, one of the great things about events is all of the networking that we get to do. So I'm glad you're taking advantage of that. As we start our next session, we do have another candidate in the house that I'd like to introduce. Monica Trinell is here. Is Monica in the room right now? All right. Well, Monica is running for the Western House District, so please visit with her when you get a chance. Our next speakers I like to call the Highline Powerhouse. And we, having heard from the legislative leadership, we are now taking a deeper dive into the legislative outlook for 2025. How weird is that? 2025 is right around the corner. And leading the discussion today is Jessie Luther, who is a partner in the Taylor Luther Group, and she grew up in Cut Bank, and Representative Lou Jones from Conrad. So I'll hand it over to Jessie.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, everybody. Sorry to cut your networking break a little short. It's always more fun to chat in the hall, but Lou and I get to do a little bit of a recap of what you've heard thus far and maybe a preview of the next two directors that are going to be up. This morning's panel talked a lot, I think, for the first time about property tax. And property tax is something that has been in the news. You've heard a ton about it. It is going to be probably the number one biggest issue in the 2025 legislative session. And I am thankful that Representative Jones is up here with me because he is the numbers guy and has put together some detailed information on, how we got to where we're at with this problem and maybe some potential solutions. But this will be the hot button issue, I think, of the 2025 legislative session.
So again, welcome, and it's always interesting standing in front and being told to be a numbers expert. But let's talk property tax, and let's talk tax as a whole. Hopefully I can see these slideshows when they come up. What's different? What makes today unique? What's changed? So first off, I always begin these conversations by saying that the state of Montana runs on income tax, right? It's about 70% income tax. It does bring in the 95 mills, but by law that is redistributed to school districts. And it brings in 6 mills, the state does, redistributes the 6 mills to the university systems, which aren't all in Helena. Obviously they're in Bozeman, Missoula, Havre, wherever there is a university component. So property tax. There's several things I wanted to point out. There's 18 classes of property tax. Montana has a lot of classes, each class with a different rate. The legislature is in control of the number, the rate, the 1.35. But ultimately the property tax serves cities, counties, towns, special districts. And if they're collecting $1,000 and you reduce the rate on one class of property, the other classes of property automatically rise to fulfill the difference. Unless there's a spending reduction somewhere, you aren't making decisions to cut taxes when you change rates, you're making decisions of who pays. So of course this session, our big discussion was residential property tax, right, across the 18 rates. And so I wanted to point out some things that have occurred over the last 20 years. So one I highlighted on that slide is 76%. When you add up all the property in the state of Montana, you add up the mines, you add up the valuations of all the property, today 76% of the value will be residential, which has changed about 20% in the last 20 years. As we have lost some of the industrial, as we've simply seen valuation shifts, residential has become a substantial market value share of the book of business. You also see that residential, where it's 76% or 75, and without my glasses I can't get to details, 76%, it only pays about 58% of the taxes. It's already at a lower rate. Now that doesn't mean it's not increasing, but it already is getting a discount. And so when you go over the years, residential went up since the 2000s from 53% to 76% of the market value. We know the coal strips are gone, the stone's gone, half the timber mills are closed. There's been lots of changes in Montana. We also know that this feeds 56% of all property tax goes to schools, 28% to counties, cities and towns, 11%, special districts, the remainder. We understand there's a tax shift, right? So when everybody says all you got to do is drop the rate on residential, well, I think some of you might own some commercial. You would actually give yourself a tax increase. And now maybe that's fair, but commercial's already at 1.89. It would automatically shift. It would have to. The other thing that stands out, and I wanted folks to understand, is were it easy, we could have simply done it, but residential's not the same in every district. You see up there that it's 58% of the tax base in the average county. However, on the next slide, this is where residential runs from. And what you can see that if you're over in Madison or Lake, of your taxes, residential is paying 80+%. I believe in the Flathead, it's at 78%. It is all they really have. Now you go to the other end of the scale and you've got net proceeds, you've got all sorts of other items paying taxes. In some of the rural counties, maybe it's 20%, maybe ag's 20%. So what does that mean? If we make a decision to change residential tax rates in one area, the impact in that area is substantially different in an area that has a different tax mix. Who's it shifting to? And so as we talk about changing these rates, we have to actually look at the math, because a perfect solution for the Gallatin could wipe Richland off the map. A perfect solution for Richland could do devastation to the Gallatin. Who's it shifting to? You push one side of the balloon on old Bob's story statement, you push one side of the balloon, the other side comes out. And then the argument is, well, we could shift it to the state. All right, that's fine. We can shift it to the state. You're shifting it to income tax, which is your other pocket. But given where Montana's at, without a sales tax today, and with a huge move-in, a destination demand we'll talk about briefly, we are then missing a whole lot of folks. If you're Eureka, you're missing all the Canadian houses. If you're in Yellowstone Club, you're missing about most of the houses. You know, when you shift it to income tax, you have said the W-2 player, and your businesses all pay too. Who pays, right? So obviously we all want to pay less, but who pays matters. And I'm not going to spend hours on these charts, but I always think it's fascinating to show. If you look across the top of this, you can see the growth in the market value. What residential has become in 20 years, I did 20 on this one instead of the 23, what it's become, and I also want to point out that today, actually, over 20 years ago, residential's getting actually a 3% discount. It always had a lower rate, but today it's actually got a bigger discount than it did in the past. Now that doesn't mean this increase isn't real and people don't have something to shout about, but when you put numbers to it, it's an interesting discussion, right? What's going on with residential? The other chart that always, and this I just stole this from and I showed these lines on these charts. I should have probably put them up as we spoke, but I have a tough time seeing it, right? But again, I think that chart shows you what has changed in the residential share of the market and the discounts in the market. This chart is what made taxes really difficult this time. You had Richland County with no residential value increase. And you had other counties, Granite up there at 67% increase in residential. And I'm fond of telling folks, man, we had a certain portion of the state act just like Hawaii. We had a destination demand where there's trees and in certain areas. It was just massive destination. In fact, we were the #1 state in tourism during COVID. We're still in the top 3. But a portion of us behaves like Hawaii. We seem to have been discovered and people are moving in, but not all of us. The eastern 40% doesn't act like Hawaii much at all. It acts like it always acted, right? And so when you talk about the residential increase, you're not talking about all of Montana, you're talking about some of Montana. And if you mitigate the residential increase, let's just imagine we did something simple and took 135 and made it 0.94. I've heard that solution out there. What does that do to those places where residential didn't go up at all? I can tell you that what it does to commercial and ag and what other class of property they have. You get to pay a hell of a lot more. So are there solutions? Yeah, but not the simple ones of the past, because the book of business looks different today. And then We are looking at this. I was supposed to talk some about solutions a little bit. Obviously, there's groups working on it. The MARA, which is a group that I'm part of, it's modernization and risk analysis. It's actually started in Montana, and now a bunch of other states are looking to adopt it. Is we have the best ability to look at data that we ever have. Far more, I call them kids, but they're young people that are really good with systems. We can see county by county more clearly than ever before. We can build models to see what happens. Obviously, Governor Gianforte announced a task force that he's going to put together, which would be able to use both MARA and DOR data. And the Revenue Interim Committee is looking at this. So there are things being looked at in this area and potentials that could happen. What do I see happening? I think we're going to have to go back to something we gave up a bit in the past, and I think we're going to have to reconsider some of the homestead exemption stuff. So if it is our intent to say owner dwellings and long-term rentals, workforce housing, right, pays a lower rate, then who pays a higher rate? And I think a person could potentially say, okay, the residential rate is 2.2%, but there's a 50% homestead exemption if it's a owner dwelling, a Montana owner dwelling, and a long-term rental, right? Then you'd be paying 1.1 on them. Or maybe you could have other categories, time in the house, etc. But if you don't want to shift to move out of class, given that it's 76% of the class, you're going to have to hold a discussion of what now exists in the class. 20 years ago, Airbnb was but a conversation hardly anybody heard. It's interesting now that if you have a little mini hotel that's called a short-term rental, that it's taxed differently than a hotel. Why would that be fair? So we are building these models, these discussions. I think we can smooth. I think you can do stuff that says if it increases above 10%, you put it in over 3 years. I think we can look at a lot of items. But this conversation that just a magic bullet, a one-day special session can solve all this, man, they must be a hell of a lot smarter than I am. Because I don't see those solutions as that simple. I think to do this correctly, we better have some models, and we need to be able to look at it county by county and district by district, or we're not going to like what happens to certain areas. Somebody will become a victim. So,
Representative Jones, one thing that I think some folks in the business community and the general public have been talking a lot about, and the Chamber did quite a bit of polling on this earlier this fall, we always talk about the third leg of the stool. Montana has the income tax and the property tax. Do you think that it is viable in the next legislative session to talk about statewide sales tax or a local option type tax? What are your thoughts on that generally?
So as we become a bigger visitor state, I think that conversation will ultimately have to become, right, is the one, if we have 11 million visitors, which we did, and we don't have them participate, then I guess we get to pay for the roads and the water and the sewer that they use. So there is that conversation, but here's the brutal truth. I believe the Chamber did poll it. If I remember their numbers, it doubled in popularity. It went from 10% to 20%. So
It's going up.
So I would suggest that it's probably not politically possible. So given that it's not politically possible, it's unlikely to be viable. The challenge with an option tax, if you look at these items, and the big seven are always after an option tax, is that the single largest retail competitor we have is e-commerce, right? I believe if you use South Dakota's numbers, 26% of all goods delivered are delivered via e-commerce. It doesn't participate. So the issue with an option tax is, congratulations, you're going to the flower shop and you're telling them they're going to charge a little extra to sell flowers, while the street they pay for with the UPS truck on it gets to sell flowers without that being a part of that. And so there's some challenges to an option tax where it certainly doesn't touch what has become the biggest leak. The reality is our tax system was built for a time of natural resources. We did have a three-legged stool. We had natural resources, which were a significant part. We had and income and property tax. But natural resources are still significant in Montana, but they're not in the dance like they used to be. They are no longer given what's happening in particular in the western portion, they simply aren't as large, and they certainly could come back at some level. But Montana's become discovered. It's been high tech. It's got a lot of things going on that it didn't used to have, and a lot of the big industrial has gone away.
Thank you. I just know that was going to be one of our questions if we didn't pre-answer it.
So let's talk demographics. We talks about folks moving in. So again, this is part of that data system we spoke about. This isn't the clearest chart, but as you think about what's happening in Montana, I just wanted the color shades up here. If it's blue, you're gaining in people. And I don't think we see, and once in a while you'll have a county or some area where there happens to be a little boom in the east that gets a little blue. And it doesn't take a lot if you're a real rural county to get a little blue. But I want you to notice the blues where the trees are. So we do have move-in, right? We have a faster move-in than we've seen before. And we have a move-in not just of older people, we have a move-in actually more younger people and older people. We have a demographic move-in that's occurring. And we have a move-in of people that are wealthier than Montana at all age groups, right? They're moving in and they're wealthier than Montanans. And so our 10-year migration patterns show a significant move-in. I keep saying it seems like we've been discovered, but not all of Montana's been discovered. And that where they're moving in is where you're seeing the housing pressures. You're seeing all that impact on residential rates. You're seeing a bunch of the shortages. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just not something that used to happen in Montana. So first we have a move-in, and it seems to be accelerating. And then if I pick another plane here. And many of you have seen this chart over the years if you've been involved in politics. We used to talk, the first side of the little chart that bulges out there showed you the graying of Montana, right? We are an old state, and a lot of natural resources states are, and we were talking about we weren't getting young people. But who's moving in is changing that. We are moving into the Bozeman's, into a lot of those areas, a younger workforce, a wealthier workforce. And if you notice the forecast 20 years out, Montana's still going to be a little grayer than the nation, but it's that bubble that was moving on seems to be leaving. Now, I'd like to tell you that's happening everywhere in Montana, but it's not. It's happening in the move-in areas, in the destination areas. And occasionally you'll have a boom somewhere else. So we are bringing people in, but we're not bringing in people, everybody. I keep saying part of us acts like Hawaii. And then I wanted to show the income charts because I hear this all the time. You know, those poor over 65-year-old people, they're being screwed, right? I hear that constantly. Well, in truth, everybody that's moving in, here's what the data shows, because you got to remember on your taxes, we can sort above 65 and below 65. We can also see part-year residents and full-year residents, so there's stuff we can pull with our new systems off of the taxes. So what that shows you that everybody moving in has a higher median and average, whichever way you want to look at it, because the problem with an average wealth, if Bill Gates sat in this room, we'd probably average $1 million each. But but median and average, we're wealthier. The move-in folks are wealthier. In Montana, the older folks are on average and median substantially wealthier than the young folks. And the older folks moving in are substantially wealthier than our already wealthier older folks. You know, it's folks often ask why I have resisted people that are paying Social Security in Montana over 65 should be given tax-free. Well, I guess I don't feel that the younger people should pay more taxes because that occurs. Now, that doesn't mean we can't help with some circuit breakers and PTAP brokers, because there's certainly folks that are older that are only on Social Security. But we're moving in people into certain areas of the state. It's impacting what we look like. It's driving demand, but not statewide. It's causing an interesting shift, right? And again, you guys, I'm sure, will have access to these slides, but I just stuck numbers up because they entertain me. In Madison County, the average new resident, their average wealth was $1.7 million that moved in. Now, their full-year ones were already fairly wealthy at $215. The new folks were a little wealthier. So when you look down those charts, you can see who's moving in. Moving people are where they're moving and what they're bringing with them for wealth compared to our full-year residents. So we are moving in a wealthy group of folks. A lot of them in the 55 to 64, some younger, and we're moving in wealthy people. And again, since we have a half hour, I won't spend hours on this, but where are they moving? Well, there's their under 65 growth, there's the over 65 growth. You know, you can see where they're moving by percent. And you gotta remember Montana grew at about 1.35%. So when you're growing at 6.96%, you're a little faster than what Montana on average grew. Montana is shrinking. It's an increasingly becoming an urban-rural state. We have an urbanization going on. Rural's getting more rural, urban's getting more urban, and where there's trees and where there's destination Hawaii-like demand, you've got some housing pressure. We have to deal with this concept as well. And one more chart on this.
One more chart, okay. So we wanted to do a deep dive on this since nobody's touched on it yet, and then we'll touch quickly in our last 5 minutes on some of the other major topics.
So you're telling me to hurry? Is that the suggestion? I love this.
It was very PC though.
Yeah, very, very subtle. So I love this chart. This is a chart I think that puts a bunch of it together. If you remember, Yellowstone was the heart of Montana, right? The natural resource base of Montana, coal, oil, the king. For the longest I can remember, Yellowstone was the largest tax value in the state, till it wasn't. So Yellowstone, with 180,000 people, has less taxable wealth than the Gallatin by a lot now, with its 123,000 people. Flathead just caught it with 108,000 people. And you wanted something interesting on the chart? Madison, with 9,000 people, has a higher tax value than Cascade County, than Lewis and Clark County. We have something unique going on in Montana. Part of us is acting like Hawaii. If we take an old solution to taxes and apply it to a new problem, we're not going to like the outcome. You have to put some time into getting this right. With that, I will let you move on and ask.
Thank you. But I do think that was valuable. Representative Jones always has a wealth of information and allows us to think about things a little bit differently, a slightly different way than you're reading in the paper, perhaps. So yesterday, those of you that were here heard all about Medicaid expansion. We had an amazing panel with Sherry Taylor, John Goodnow, Representative Buttrey, and Bob Olson. This, I think, is going to be a huge issue in the next legislative session. Healthy workforce is a big deal for the employers in the room. If our workforce is healthy, they are working for you. I think the case was made pretty easily yesterday about the economic impacts and the reasons to continue expansion. But it will be a major topic of a discussion. You heard it again this morning from leadership. It's going to be a tight vote. There's going to be a lot of folks that feel certain ways about that issue. So it's something that the legislature will spend some time on.
And I can't say it any clearer than that. It's going to be a tight vote, in particular in the Senate. I think expansion, the mathematics support expansion, the ideology does not always support expansion. We will see what holds sway in the day.
And so I think workforce continues to be an issue. Sheridan Johnson led a great panel on childcare yesterday. You heard about that. The panel after us is going to be on attainable and affordable housing and the housing resource in Montana. We have to have somebody to watch the children for our workforce, and we have to have somewhere for our workforce to live. So while there were great strides made, I think, in the 2023 legislative session, I think there's still some more work to be done, so I think that will be revisited in 2025.
And again, Jesse hit that right. You've had other panels on it. Since this is short, I won't push this any deeper. Affordable child care, again, a debate that ranges across the ideology of whether government should be involved in child care in any manner or not. What's the right involvement? What's the right partnership? Obviously, a significant source of increased employment can be a working population, and child care is required for that. And housing, some bills on that, and those bills will continue. Again, staying brief so that we get to stuff
Well, we have new news. So new news that you haven't heard yet and you won't hear anywhere else today. Ballot initiatives. Montana is a state where we have citizen initiatives. Anyone can propose any idea and put it on the ballot for folks to vote on in November. So there are a couple interesting ones that I think, if they are successful and do pass, may require the legislature to consider. The first two that I think are interesting are dealing with elections. There's one that proposes to take our traditional Republican-Democrat primary system of elections and changing it to a top 4 primary. So without party affiliation, in the general election, you as a voter would have the ability to vote on the top 4 candidates and the top 4 vote receivers from the primary.
Some significant billionaires actually pushing this across the country. They look at DC and say the chaos on DC has come to pass because we've become too hyper-partisan, that the parties are selecting from an extremer right candidate and an extremer left candidate. And that their feeling is, and again mathematically some argument, that if you say top 4 goes on, you're going to moderate the system. You're going to create a candidate in the general, in particular, if 50% plus one win, some way to establish a 51% winner, that you're going to moderate the cycle. There's some evidence that that is true, and that if you want to, I know I was looking at some polls that came in, they've polled it, and the general populace tends to be very tired of the DC chaos and the stalemates. So that one's going on. We're getting waves from the back, so we'll quit on the top 4.
Yeah. Well, I just want to, the wrap up is the sister to the top 4 is a majority vote. Right now in Montana, you can win with a plurality. I think this is the one the legislature will have to visit, because if we pass a majority required, then they're going to have to consider either ranked choice voting, runoff elections, or some other topic. But those have to get signatures to make the ballots, and you guys get a chance to decide.
Abortion rights group is proposing an amendment. We saw that pass in Kansas, Utah. In fact, it's actually passed almost everywhere so far since Roe Wade. It's been on a ballot. That'll probably likely be up in front of you, and then probably the Held decision, which I don't have a slide for.
But you guys got to hear about that yesterday, so
yes, so you understand that what happens there, depending on what the Supreme Court does, is likely to require some legislative input. And that was a fairly quick half hour, so hopefully it was informative.
Thank you. Thanks for the extra 2 minutes, Charles.
Thank you so much, Representative Jones and Jesse. And I just want to give a special shout out for his service to Representative Jones, who has served since 2005 in the House, then in the Senate, and now in the House again. And quite honestly, I've never met anybody that understands numbers and can explain them to other people as well as Representative Jones. So thank you for that, and thank you for the service to our state.